The Crystal Lounge was the crown jewel of uptown dining, its opulent chandeliers casting a golden glow over marble floors and tables adorned with fine china. It was the kind of place where the city's elite gathered, a haven for wealth and status. Among them that evening was Victoria Hastings, a woman who epitomized privilege. Draped in a tailored designer dress, her diamond necklace caught the light as she sipped her wine with an air of practiced indifference. Victoria prided herself on her sophistication. A real estate mogul in her mid-40s, she had spent years cultivating an image of elegance and authority. To her, the world was divided into two types of people, those who thrived and those who served. And tonight, as she dined with a few friends from her social circle, she had no intention of paying much attention to the latter. The waiter assigned to her table, Darius Reed, moved with calm efficiency. In his early 30s, Darius had a quiet dignity about him. His neatly pressed uniform and polite demeanor suggested professionalism, but there was something in his posture, a quiet confidence, that set him apart. Despite the occasional curt demands from patrons like Victoria, he carried himself with grace, never letting the dismissiveness of others rattle him. Victoria, however, was unimpressed. "Excuse me," she called sharply, snapping her fingers as Darius approached with their entrees. "This wine is too warm. Don't you know how to serve it properly?" Darius remained calm, offering a small nod. "I'll bring you a fresh glass, ma'am." She waved him off dismissively. "Yes, you do that." Her friends chuckled softly, sharing knowing looks. Victoria's disdain for those she considered beneath her was no secret. To her, Darius was just another faceless worker, someone who existed to ensure her comfort. As the evening wore on, Victoria's criticisms continued. Her steak wasn't cooked to her liking. The dessert arrived too late, and the ambience, she declared loudly, was subpar. Through it all, Darius remained composed, addressing each complaint with professionalism. When the check finally arrived, Victoria glanced at it briefly before sliding it across the table. "No tip," she said coldly, loud enough for Darius to hear. "Service like that doesn't deserve one." Darius's expression didn't change, but Victoria caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Disappointment, perhaps, or something deeper. She dismissed it immediately. To her, a waiter's opinion mattered little. She paid the bill and gathered her things, ready to leave the restaurant and forget the night altogether. But little did she know, the man she had just dismissed so easily wasn't who she thought he was. And what she was about to learn would challenge everything she believed about status, success, and the value of human kindness. As Victoria rose to leave the Crystal Lounge, her stiletto heels clicked sharply against the polished floor. She didn't glance back at Darius, who was quietly clearing her table, collecting the untouched remnants of her extravagant meal. To her, he was just another invisible figure in the background of her curated life. Outside, the night was cool, the streets bustling with activity. Victoria's sleek black car idled at the curb, her driver stepping out to open the door for her. Just as she was about to slide into the back seat, she heard a sharp cry from the corner of the street. "Somebody help!" Victoria turned, her perfectly arched brows furrowing in annoyance. Near the edge of the sidewalk, a young girl, no older than 10, was crouched beside an elderly man who had collapsed, clutching his chest. A small crowd began to gather, murmurs of concern rippling through the air. But no one stepped forward. Victoria hesitated, glancing at her car, debating whether she should intervene. "Where's the ambulance?" she muttered, folding her arms as if the situation was an inconvenience. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the restaurant's entrance. It was Darius. His pace quickened as he moved toward the man, his composure unshaken even in the face of the emergency. Victoria watched in quiet disbelief as the waiter knelt beside the man, speaking calmly to the distraught girl. "It's going to be okay," Darius said, his voice steady and reassuring. "What's your name?" "Sophie," the girl whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Sophie, I need you to stay calm for me, okay? I'm going to help your grandpa," Darius said, his tone warm and confident. He checked the man's pulse, his movements deliberate and knowledgeable. Does he have any medical conditions? He has heart problems, Sophie stammered. He takes pills, but we don't have them with us. Darius nodded, pulling his phone from his pocket. I'm calling 911 now. They'll be here soon. Victoria stood frozen, her mind struggling to reconcile the image of the quiet waiter with the man now commanding the scene. His actions were methodical yet compassionate, his focus entirely on the elderly man and the frightened child. After placing the call, Darius returned his attention to Sophie. The ambulance is on its way. But in the meantime, we'll make sure your grandpa is as comfortable as possible. He removed his jacket, folding it neatly and placing it under the man's head. The gesture was simple, but it carried a warmth that caught Victoria off guard. She could see the gratitude in Sophie's eyes as she clung to Darius's calm demeanor like a lifeline. The murmurs of the crowd grew quieter as they watched Darius work, his quiet authority commanding their respect. Even Victoria, who had spent the evening dismissing him, found herself captivated by his actions. There was a quiet strength in him, a selflessness that stood in stark contrast to the entitlement she often saw in her own world. The sound of sirens pierced the night, and soon, paramedics arrived. Darius stepped back, giving them space to work but staying close to reassure Sophie. You're very brave, Sophie, he said, his voice soft. Your grandpa is lucky to have you. As the ambulance drove away, Sophie turned to Darius, her small voice trembling. Thank you, Mr. Darius smiled, his face kind but weary. Anytime. Victoria, still standing a few feet away, felt a strange tug in her chest. She had spent the evening treating Darius as if he were invisible. Yet here he was, doing what she couldn't, helping someone without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. For the first time in years, she felt the uneasy stirrings of shame. Darius's actions had shown her a depth of character she hadn't thought to look for, and she couldn't ignore the growing realization that she had misjudged him. As Victoria settled into the back seat of her car, the faint glow of the city lights blurred past her window. She was silent, her perfectly polished nails tapping lightly on the leather armrest. The image of Darius kneeling beside the elderly man and comforting the young girl replayed in her mind like a film reel she couldn't turn off. For years, Victoria had prided herself on her ability to read people, to categorize them neatly into those who mattered and those who didn't. But tonight, her certainty had been shaken. Darius's selflessness, his quiet confidence, and his ability to take control in a chaotic moment didn't fit the box she had placed him in. Back at her penthouse apartment, Victoria poured herself a glass of wine, hoping it would calm the unease stirring in her chest. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the sprawling city below. From this height, everything seemed small and manageable, but tonight, her perspective felt skewed. Her thoughts wandered to the way she had treated Darius earlier in the evening. The dismissive tone, the refusal to tip, the way she had spoken as if he were less than her. At the time, it had seemed justified. He was just a waiter, after all. But now, the memory made her cringe. She had been wrong, so wrong. The next morning, Victoria found herself back at the Crystal Lounge, a place she rarely visited twice in 1 week. She had convinced herself it was to meet a friend for brunch. But deep down, she knew why she had returned. As she walked in, her sharp heels clicking against the marble floor, her eyes scanned the room for Darius. He was there, moving between tables with the same quiet efficiency she remembered from the night before. For a moment, she hesitated. What was she supposed to say? How could she apologize for her behavior without sounding insincere? Ma'am, would you like a table? A hostess asked, breaking Victoria's train of thought. Yes, please, Victoria said, following the hostess to a small table near the window. She sat down, her heart pounding in a way she wasn't used to. She was Victoria Hastings, calm, composed, and always in control. Yet, the thought of facing Darius made her feel strangely vulnerable. When Darius approached her table, he greeted her with the same professional politeness he showed every patron. Good morning, ma'am. Can I get you started with something to drink? Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She saw no bitterness in his eyes, no trace of resentment for how she had treated him the night before. That only deepened her guilt. "Darius," she began, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "About last night, I owe you an apology." Darius tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but curious. "There's no need for that, ma'am." "Yes, there is," Victoria insisted. She placed her hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. "I was rude to you. Worse than rude, I was dismissive and unfair. And then I saw you outside, helping that man and his granddaughter without hesitation. You didn't just step in, you made a difference. I misjudged you." Darius paused, his gaze steady but unreadable. After a moment he said, "Thank you for saying that. But I wasn't helping for recognition or to prove anything. It was just the right thing to do." His words struck Victoria like a gentle but firm reprimand. She had spent so much of her life striving to assert her status and superiority. But here was a man who carried himself with humility and purpose, expecting nothing in return. Later that day, Victoria found herself pacing her spacious office, her assistant hesitantly knocking on the door. "Ms. Hastings, the board meeting starts in 5 minutes. "I know," Victoria replied distractedly, waving the assistant off. She wasn't thinking about real estate deals or profit margins. Her mind was consumed with a different question. How could she make amends? Victoria had always believed that her success was measured by how much she could achieve, how many accolades she could gather. But now she was beginning to wonder if true success was about something more, about how you treated people, about the legacy you left behind. That evening she made a decision. She called the manager of the Crystal Lounge and asked for Darius's full name. At first, the manager hesitated, but after some persuasion, Victoria had what she needed. She began researching, curious about the man who had quietly challenged everything she believed about power and status. What she found surprised her. Darius wasn't just a waiter. He had once been a promising law student, but his education had been derailed when his mother fell ill, leaving him as the sole caretaker for his younger siblings. His story was one of resilience and sacrifice, a stark contrast to Victoria's world of privilege. For the first time in years, Victoria felt the weight of her privilege, not as something to flaunt but as something she could use to help others. And she knew exactly where to start. 2 days after her encounter with Darius, Victoria Hastings found herself back at the Crystal Lounge. This time, she wasn't there to dine or meet friends. She had arranged a private meeting with the restaurant manager, who was equally surprised and intrigued by her request. As Victoria sat in one of the empty booths, she clutched a small folder in her hands. Her thoughts were clear for once, unclouded by ego or pride. She wasn't here to simply apologize. She wanted to make a meaningful difference. When Darius walked into the room, his expression was neutral but curious. He had been told a patron wanted to speak with him privately, but he hadn't expected it to be her. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he greeted politely. Victoria rose to her feet, her voice softer than usual. "Darius, thank you for meeting me. I know this is unusual, but I needed to talk to you." Darius nodded, his hands clasped in front of him. "What can I do for you?" She took a deep breath, the words coming slowly but with conviction. "I owe you more than an apology. After our last encounter, I did some research. I learned about your background, your education, your sacrifices for your family, and everything you've endured to get to where you are now. And I realized I've been living in my own bubble for far too long." Darius's calm demeanor shifted slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "You didn't have to do that," he said cautiously. "Yes, I did," Victoria insisted, her tone firm but earnest. "Because I needed to understand the depth of my mistake. I treated you as if you were invisible, as if your worth was tied to your job. But in reality, you've shown more character, strength, and kindness than most people I know." Victoria gestured to the folder on the table. "That's why I've made some arrangements. I spoke to a few people in my network, and they've agreed to support your law school journey if you still want it." Darius's eyes widened, and he stared at her in disbelief. "Law school?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Victoria nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she continued. "You deserve a chance to finish what you started. You've already proven the kind of person you are, Darius. Someone who stands up for others, who makes a difference. And we need more people like you in the legal system." For a long moment, Darius said nothing. His gaze dropped to the folder, then back to Victoria. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. She smiled faintly, her expression tinged with humility. "Because I owe you, and not just for how I treated you. You reminded me of what truly matters. It's not about titles or wealth. It's about what we do for others. You showed me that." In the weeks that followed, Victoria became more involved in the process of helping Darius secure his place in law school. She introduced him to her network of colleagues, many of whom were eager to support someone with his potential. Meanwhile, Darius continued working at the restaurant, balancing his job with the preparation for his next chapter. Their interactions grew more frequent, and with each meeting, Victoria found herself learning more about resilience, humility, and purpose. Darius, in turn, began to see her not as the entitled woman from their first encounter, but as someone capable of growth and genuine kindness. Months later, Victoria attended Darius's farewell dinner at the Crystal Lounge. The staff had organized a small celebration to honor him before he left to begin his studies. Victoria sat among the crowd, watching as Darius stood to give a short speech. "I never thought I'd be standing here," Darius began, his voice steady but emotional. "Life has a way of throwing challenges at you, and for a long time, I thought I'd never get back to pursuing my dreams. But sometimes, help comes from the most unexpected places." He glanced at Victoria, his smile warm and sincere. "Ms. Hastings, thank you for believing in me. Not just for giving me this opportunity, but for reminding me that people can change, that we can all do better." The room erupted in applause, and Victoria felt a lump rise in her throat. For the first time in years, she felt like she was part of something meaningful, something bigger than herself. A few weeks later, Victoria received a handwritten letter from Darius. In it, he thanked her again and shared how his journey was unfolding. But what struck her most was the final line. "Your kindness changed my path, and I promise to use it to change the paths of others. That's the legacy we'll both share." Victoria framed the letter, placing it on her desk as a reminder of the day she chose to step outside her comfort zone and make a difference. The experience had changed them both. For Darius, it was a chance to pursue his dreams and fulfill his potential. For Victoria, it was a lesson in humility, gratitude, and the power of second chances. Their story served as a reminder that no matter how far apart two lives may seem, kindness and understanding can bridge the gap, and that sometimes, the smallest acts of compassion can create ripples that change the world. Weeks turned into months, and as the seasons changed, so did Victoria Hastings. One afternoon, she found herself sitting on a park bench overlooking a serene lake, a place she hadn't visited in years. The sun cast a warm glow over the water, and the sound of laughter filled the air as families enjoyed the day. Darius approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Mind if I join you?" he asked with a warm smile. She looked up, returning his smile genuinely. "Not at all. Please." He sat beside her, handing her a cup. "It's been a while since we've had a chance to talk." Victoria nodded, gazing out at the shimmering lake. "I've been reflecting a lot lately. About life, priorities, what truly matters." Darius took a sip of his coffee. "I think we both have. Law school has been challenging, but every day I feel more certain it's where I'm meant to be." She turned to face him, her eyes softening. "I'm so proud of you, Darius. You've worked hard to get here. But more than that, you've inspired me to be better." He raised an eyebrow, curiosity in his gaze. "How so?" Victoria sighed gently. "I spent so much of my life climbing a ladder that seemed to lead nowhere meaningful. Meeting you made me realize that success isn't about wealth or status. It's about impact, kindness, and connection." Darius smiled thoughtfully. "You know, I could say the same about you. Your willingness to help changed my life. It reminded me that people are capable of incredible generosity." She shook her head modestly. "I had the means but lacked the purpose. You gave me that. Helping you was the best decision I've ever made." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the gentle breeze rustling the leaves above them. Children's laughter echoed as they chased each other nearby, their joy infectious. Funny how life brings people together, Darius mused. Two paths crossing in the most unexpected way. Victoria chuckled softly. If someone had told me a year ago that a simple dinner would lead to such a profound change, I wouldn't have believed them. Sometimes, it takes a moment like that to open our eyes, Darius agreed. To see beyond ourselves. She looked at him, gratitude shining in her eyes. You've taught me that it's never too late to change, to make a difference. I want to continue doing that, using what I have to help others. Darius reached out and gently squeezed her hand. And I'll do the same. Together, we can create a ripple effect of kindness. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the landscape, Victoria felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. The weight of her past choices seemed to lift, replaced by hope and purpose. Thank you, Darius, she whispered. For everything. He smiled warmly. Thank you, Victoria. For seeing me, for believing in me. They stood up, ready to embrace the future. Walking side by side, they left the park, each step symbolizing a new chapter filled with possibility. In that moment, they both understood a simple truth. That true wealth isn't measured by what you have but by what you give. And by choosing compassion over indifference, they had not only changed their own lives but had begun to touch the lives of many others. Because sometimes, all it takes is a single act of kindness to illuminate the path toward a more meaningful life.